Okay, so I think this is an issue for almost everyone, male or female. It's hard to have everything, but I'm convinced that you can actually have quite a lot. When I'll begin with a few disclosures. Oops. I have no commercial or intellectual disclosures here, but there are a few others. This work-life balance or integration thing isn't easy. And I personally have been known to whine more than a few times about the state of my own life. I'm not sure I've been all that successful in achieving balance, certainly not at certain moments. But all in all, life has been pretty darn good. I think when we start, and you could turn this slide into a male version just as quickly as I put it together as a woman's view, but we start not only hoping to be first-rate physicians, but some of us really want to be scientists, maybe even Nobel laureates. We want to have friends that we entertain. We want to have family and treat them particularly well, be it our kids' every soccer game, be a marvelous significant other, glamorous, understanding, and we want to stay in shape, and we want the house of our dreams that is perfectly maintained. It doesn't take very long before hanging on to all of that at least makes us frantic. And if we don't start rethinking, we're soon exhausted, and many will get to the point of being depressed or even burned out or even clinically depressed. Before I get into my thoughts about some of the ways that you can avoid some of that, let me just outline my own path for those of you who don't know me at all. I trained in both pediatrics and anesthesiology and then critical care medicine long enough ago that was the way one got to intensive care. I was on the faculty at CHOP in Philadelphia for a year before, and then I was recruited to go to run the pediatric ICU at Children's in Pittsburgh. The reason I was recruited 1 year out of fellowship is that at that point in my specialty, there were probably only about 6 people in the country senior to me, and they'd already tried to recruit them. So they didn't have too many choices. I was fortunate enough that opportunity was absolutely marvelous. The ICU and the division thrived, and I began to get really involved with the hospital as a whole. I got interested in healthcare policy and management and got a degree at Carnegie Mellon University addressing that. I was an ELAM fellow, and I became associate dean for faculty affairs without actually ever giving up my critical care job. I had some hopes that would get me to about half as much night call, but in fact, what I had was a job and a half. Following that, I got even more involved in broad hospital issues, and then ultimately was made vice dean of the School of Medicine and distinguished service professor. Along the way, there was personal, outside of work, a lot of satisfaction. I got married and had a baby as I finished, or as I began to be an attending. Unfortunately, my marriage didn't last. So I was divorced in about the year 2000. But I became a grandmother about 13 years ago. I had the same time, a lot of work in professional organizations, and was fortunate enough to be given some leadership roles fairly early on. And that just expanded and included some awards as I progressed through my career. And on top of all that, we all learned to ski and rollerblade. We took some great vacations. We watched a lot of Little League, and I really liked cooking, so we did a fair amount of that. So I feel like things have been remarkably satisfying as I really am approaching the end of my professional career. So for what do we need to be off to a good start? And I think you've all heard the expression, begin with the end in mind. It's really important to define your goals. Where do you want to be in the proverbial 5 to 10 years? But not just in your career, also in all the other elements of your life. If you have one big career dream, then you really need to work at making sure that your job speaks to your primary focus, regardless, whatever that is. And then try, since you're almost surely going to be called on to do some service, try really hard to match your service to that focus. And if you need new skills, what are they? Will your department support it? And when can you fit those in? In order to address these things, not just in your career, but in everything, you need to negotiate for what you need in every realm of your life. I think it's common that people tell you you'll need a good mentor and sponsor. Sometimes I think you need more than one mentor, somebody in your field, somebody who's perhaps in a different field, but doing similar or related work, and then someone who will promote you, put you forward to participate in the larger community that you work with. And then finally, it's absolutely essential in order to maintain some balance to buy some help. And I want to talk mostly about these three with the check marks by them. Now, assuming that you have given up the idea that you can be Superwoman, which I realize is a big assumption, but it's the assumption I'll start with. I said it's important to think about the scope of goals, and that's career for sure, but family, financial, physical, community, whatever else is important to you. And then think about what are the must-haves, the things that you know that if you don't have these things, you will not be satisfied. And then what are the nice to have? If you possibly can work it out, it would be icing on the cake, but you might be able to give it up. And then if your must-haves are too exacting, maybe you need to talk about your standards and think about reviewing them and see if you can modify them. You have to set goals in multiple domains. And then once you've done that, you have to tend to them. You need to evaluate your time apportionment over time. First of all, what do you think will work for you? And then as time goes on, is it working for you? And if not, where do you need to make adjustments? I mentioned if you have one big career dream, you might try writing your history of the future. I don't know whether any of you have seen this way of thinking about things, but just as an example, if you say, what will it take to get to where I want to be in, say, 10 years? And let's just use the example of saying you want to be an associate professor with tenure. Going backwards from that, what are the steps that you'll need to accomplish? And I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but For instance, maybe you would need to have an R01 in order to get tenure. And that might take more than one try. Your first application might not be successful. So what are you going to do in between the first one and the second one? In order to get an R01, you certainly will need to have written and probably give some talks at major meetings. It helps to have had a K award before that. You'll need a mentor, either as a late fellow or early faculty member, maybe on a T32. And this is going all the way back to where I think everybody here is past fellow. But it's this idea of what are the steps that it takes to get to your dream, and then think about the time frame for each of those steps. If you break down these big goals into the necessary steps and manageable pieces with a timeline, it makes it a little easier to think about how do I get from here to there. Negotiating is hugely important. And I will say that in general, men are better at it than women. Men tend to view negotiations as a game. You know, maybe it's like a tennis match with a friend. You play just as hard as you can, but at the end, you go out for a beer afterwards, and you're best of friends. Women tend to view negotiation as going to the dentist, it's not in our best interest to not be good at negotiating. So I would urge people, if you haven't already, to consider reading these books. One is Women Don't Ask, which simply talks about the differences in our attitudes about negotiating, and also the cost of not negotiating. And then Ask for It is a really straightforward book about just the basics. If you get really interested in it, these two books are real classics and are worth studying. They're much more complex and it takes some time to digest, but the Women Don't Ask and Ask for It are easy and really help make the first steps toward being a better negotiator. You know, when you do give yourself a try at negotiating, you'll find that you need to develop a style, and it's got to be one that you're comfortable with. Women don't do particularly well if they try to negotiate in a style that works for men. And Linda Babcock, who is whom I learned some negotiation skills, talks about being relentlessly pleasant. So never being shrill, never being harsh, rarely being openly angry, just persistent and pleasant. If you're going to negotiate what you need to do it in kind of every realm of your life. And sometimes I think your first negotiation opponent is yourself. What do you absolutely have to have, and what can you let go? But what is essential to you, so that you know what you must negotiate for and what you can give a little on. Making it clear that you're not an enemy, that you're on the same team as your division, your partner, your kids, is important as a starting point. Once you've established yourself as being on their side, then it's a lot easier to have a discussion about different needs. And it's also worth thinking about, well, what would work for me? And thinking that through and developing a reason, an understanding of how what you need might be valuable for the person on the other side of this negotiation. Once you have come to an agreement, you can give it a time-limited try. And then if it's not successful after that amount of time, then both people can rethink it. When we're talking about work, and I think the case later today has a lot to do with that, how do you want your research, clinical, educational effort apportioned? And find out what other people in your setting have done. Is there someone else who has gotten what you seek? And if your wishes aren't standard, is there some way to get what you want? I mentioned earlier, if you need or want new skills, can you get your department to support you? What's in it for the department if they do support you? Can you find the right mentoring? Will you have administrative or research support? Are there startup funds? Maybe not just for research, maybe for education as well. And if you can find out before you take a job, do the leaders in this division department have a history of sponsoring women and particularly people with similar interests to yours?
Dr. Thompson, I apologize to interrupt. I just want to let you know we have 1 or 2 minutes left and hopefully give folks a minute or two to ask questions if you don't mind.
Okay. Let me just say that negotiating with your partner is critically important. It is probably the most important thing you can do. And I would just point out that it's maybe one of the hardest things. I think the slides for this will probably be available afterwards. This is a fun quote about coming to an agreement about the important things and letting some of the less important things go. How you apportion your time with children is really a challenge. You'll probably love them more than you've ever loved anyone else before, except when you don't. They will take way more time than you expected, but they don't need to have you available every minute. They benefit greatly from parents with work that they're passionate about, and they can learn a lot from finding out how to navigate their own way through difficulties. And you really can be there most of the time when it's really important. Skip over the cartoons. How much is enough is really an individual decision, but I'm quite confident that it's okay to miss the occasional soccer game. You don't have to be the one who leads the scout trip. You can contribute special things. You can teach your kids or your kids' classmates, things that are special that you have expertise at and seem very special to your child and their friends. I would urge anyone to read this wonderful paper about how this one couple negotiated their approach. And it's probably very specific to them, but it shows you just how creative you can be. I guess we're probably not going to have time, but I think learning to say no is really challenging. And so the first thing is to see, why does one say yes? And does it match your interests? Does it give you satisfaction? Does it bring recognition? Does it advance your goals? Does it provide service to someone you really care about? You want to be liked. We know that, but you don't have to say yes to everything to be liked. And there's some pathological, in my opinion, reasons for saying yes when you just are still working on being perfect. So you say yes to have a reputation as a team player, and then you say, then you If it's not possible, you try to explain your concern, offer to do something else that's important to your boss, helps that person out, asking in some other way, and that fits your interests. And I would suggest that before you say yes, you always say, let me check my schedule and I'll get back to you. It's really valuable to form a committee, often of friends or colleagues, who will be realistic when you are not. And there are people who know the scope of your commitments outside of work. So, and then finally, you don't have time for everything. Pay for help doing things you don't like, that someone else could do just as well, and that takes you away from your highest priorities. Don't let yourself be house poor. The house of your dreams can come later. Your little kids are going to be right under your feet while you're cooking, whether or not you have a big family room. And use the money you save to buy time for what's more precious. So whatever your choices, we're in permanent whitewater. Just learn to go with the flow. Enjoy the crazy ride. Keep your eye on the big picture and resist the tyranny of the urgent. Many things may change over your career. You may not reach nirvana. You probably won't, but it can be a great life. Thank you.